Well, Colorado State likes to ring the bell on August 20th to welcome in the climatological peak of Atlantic hurricane season unofficially, and it seems that the basin has really answered the call, and we have a lot to talk about in this edition of Tropical Tracker. But first, let's go ahead to and look at the Eastern Pacific to recap a very anomalous and impactful storm, Hurricane Hilary, which formed in the eastern portion of the East Pacific Basin and really tapped into a favorable environment with warm water and relatively weak vertical wind shear before eventually getting picked up by this mid-latitude trough situated off the coast of California that helped to transport its moisture, its cloud cover, really tropical air northward into a part of the world that does not necessarily expect to see it often, eventually sort of phasing together and bringing very impactful rainfall to much of the western United States. In some places, seeing some all-time record daily rainfall, for example, and in other cases, really throughout that portion of the country, a widespread region of 1+ inch rainfall. Some areas seeing as many as 4, 5, 6, even more inches over the span of 24 to 48 hours associated with the approach and the passage of Hurricane Hilary. And it was one of the only times on record that a tropical storm was recorded over mainland California, doing so really as a pretty well-established tropical storm still before eventually losing its tropical characteristics. That's all I'm going to have on Hilary for now, because tomorrow John Neese will talk about the storm in much more detail in his weekly edition of Weatherwise. For now, let's go over to the Atlantic and specifically the Gulf of Mexico, because we actually just had a tropical storm make landfall. This is Tropical Storm Harold, which has, as of about 11 a.m., made landfall in southern Texas, a little bit south of Corpus Christi here, and you can kind of see this really heavy rainfall starting to push into what has otherwise been a very dry portion of the country this year. And some of this strong 50-mile-per-hour or so wind moving into the Corpus Christi Bay, starting to push some of that water on shore and cause some coastal flooding concerns over in that portion of the state. Otherwise, pretty much flooding is going to be the main issue further inland throughout the day, with the potential for some isolated tornadoes as well, especially in this so-called right front quadrant here in the area of Corpus Christi and pushing to the north and west as the storm eventually moves inland over the next 6 to 12 hours and starts to weaken on approach to northern Mexico. Further east here, we have a look at Tropical Storm Franklin, which was designated a couple of days ago by the National Hurricane Center. And I have this satellite loop playing for about 24 hours or so because you can kind of see the evolution of deep convection here. Overnight had this really well-defined bursting pattern, and you would kind of expect that to be associated with significant intensification. But it turns out that didn't really take place. You can kind of see the outflow from that storm, these wispy clouds getting scooped away, not necessarily as much on the northwest side of the storm, and kind of sheared off to the northeast essentially, which actually also contributed to the weakening and dissipation of Tropical Storm Gert. Essentially what's happening here is dry air is actually impinging on this storm from the western side of the circulation. You can even kind of see it starting to migrate into the circulation just a little bit here. A bit of an asymmetric blob-like storm at this time that hasn't really been able to take off despite an environment of very warm water with sea surface temperatures on the order of 85 to 90 degrees in this part of the Caribbean. And as we kind of look over the next 5 days or so, not a significant intensification expected on approach to Hispaniola, where it could still be a pretty significant rainfall and mudslide threat for the mountainous portions of the island, as well as over towards Puerto Rico, before eventually entering the southwestern Atlantic later into the week and in the weekend, and thereby entering a more favorable environment for intensification, where it's expected to eventually become a hurricane, and something to kind of keep an eye out for Bermuda longer term. And we'll kind of look beyond 5 days here because of this uncertainty and this kind of trickiness in the track forecast, as it's going to be in an environment of fairly weak steering flow. So one way that you can do this, just like you might see on week 2 trends here on Weather World, is to run an ensemble, where we tweak the initial conditions several times in the same weather forecast model, in this case the GFS American model, and can hopefully try to get a range of possible outcomes for the track of the storm. And you can kind of see this sharp turn to the east, sharp turn to the north, and that eventual recurve out to sea is the kind of favored scenario for Franklin ultimately. And with that, it's going to be something to keep an eye on for, again, the island of Bermuda in particular, as a lot of these ensemble members depict Franklin becoming a particularly strong storm, at least a hurricane. And also something to maybe keep an eye on longer term in the day 7 to 10 time frame for portions of Atlantic Canada, albeit with significant uncertainty, both in terms of the storm scale evolution of Franklin, as well as some of the upstream meteorology that's going to influence its eventual steering. Elsewhere in the Atlantic, as I mentioned, we just had Gert dissipate east of the Lesser Antilles here. We also had Tropical Storm Emily. That was a bit of a flash in the pan for a couple of days, which might actually reform in the open central Atlantic in the next 5 to 7 days or so. And then also Invest 92L, which is not showing anything in terms of prolific convective organization at this time. Still a 50% chance to develop in the next 7 days or so. And that would actually be, in my opinion, kind of a good thing, because the next name on the list is Idalia, the sort of infamous ice storm. And I would personally take a storm that drifted out in the open central Atlantic compared to some of the impactful ice storms that we have seen in recent years. Longer term, we'll also keep our eyes out on another wave emerging from the Atlantic, because this is that time of the year where that part of the basin is really climatologically expected to get going. However, with this burst of activity, 4 named storms in the past 7 to 10 days or so, we're actually now running below average in terms of our accumulated cyclone energy, this combined metric that accounts for the strength and the duration of tropical cyclones, because many of these named storms this year have been relatively short-lived thanks to our kind of impressive and increasingly impressive technology in terms of being able to capture these circulations for what are otherwise perhaps unimpressive storms on satellite here. But we'll see if Franklin and some of these other systems can start to eat away at this admittedly very small deficit compared to our average of about 20 units to this time of the year. And one last thing to wrap up here, if you recall the velocity potential discussion a few times ago here on Tropical Tracker, you might remember maps like this. And I wanted to show this because all these greens here, don't worry about all these contours. It's basically just areas of large-scale rising motion. You can kind of see this right now centered over the Atlantic in this August 15th to the present-day time frame. And you can kind of see over the next couple of weeks or so this pattern start to shift eastward. And you see more of these brown colors starting to kind of creep into the picture, this large-scale sinking motion that should hopefully mean a bit of a suppression in hurricane activity as we go into the middle portion of September. Your forecast summary is coming up after this.